Transcendent Knowledge Podcast, episode number 17. This is going to be exclusively focused on James Kent, the psychedelic journalist and author and thinker, especially the final 10 episodes of DoseNation podcast. So James Kent provides an interesting perspective to compare to our own because he is a critique of pop psych, the same as we are, but he completely lacks the integration of the ego death theory. So he's had a fairly long career in psychedelic journalism, and he's set up these final 10 episodes as a kind of ultimate summary of his entire career, like an overview of his entire career and what he has learned. And there's quite a large amount of material there. It's coming up to about 30 hours of him talking. So I figured that for you and me, like our role here is, there's two things really. One is to provide a summary of all of that material by James Kent. And also part of it is to add the insight of the ego death theory, like give the potential input that the ego death theory has to clarify and correct his thinking about these various psychedelic issues.
That sounds great. I'm excited to get started. I've gotten a lot out of this project so far.
Good, and I figure the best way to do it is chronologically, whereas we just go through the various talking points that he raises over the course of the 10 episodes, and then have the relevant discussions when we come to the relevant ideas as he presents them. So to start off with episode 1, it provides a good introduction and he sets up the whole project of the forthcoming 10 episodes. And really what comes across very quickly is how he has a negative attitude towards popular psychedelic community, and he's clear to emphasize that he's talking about the community and the thinking and ideas that are present within the community. He doesn't just mean anybody who takes drugs, and he's not talking about the drugs themselves. It's very much the kind of collective ideas that are present in the psychedelic community that is the target of his criticism.
Yeah, and I think that's right. A lot of the, especially to me, it seems a lot of the ways of talking about psychedelics and, in his mind, justifying or legitimizing them, that those seem to be his targets. Was something he's, has a lot of criticisms of the way that the community at large tries to talk about psychedelics.
Yeah, you hit on, I think, the key word there, which is legitimization. He's come up with this idea of the psychedelic legitimization movement, and he's kind of attacking that movement over the course of these 10 episodes. I think one of his main kind of ideological principles that comes across quite clearly is that he thinks that psychedelic drugs simply don't deserve to be taken very seriously. They're just very weird and a lot of fun, but they're not serious, and especially they have no religious or mystical import, at least like any genuine relevance to religion and mysticism. And he sets it up like he's addressing a younger audience, and it did make me wonder, like maybe he is kind of reaching back in time to his younger self, like before he embarked on his career. And he's trying to say to his younger self that actually psychedelics aren't all that, and that he shouldn't fall for all the bullshit. He likes to use that word bullshit to really describe all of pop psych. That psychedelic drugs don't really warrant a career in journalism to be based around them, and I think it's almost like a catharsis of some kind of guilt that he took psychedelic drugs too seriously, and now he is older and wiser and he sees the error of his ways, so he's doing these 10 episodes to kind of correct that, to make amends for it.
I think that's a really interesting insight, that or idea that he is addressing his younger self. I sensed something similar listening through. I've listened through the first 4 so far in detail, and I think this will come up as we go into some of the specifics. But I kept having this nagging sense that there's a lot of his framing. He's talking about, well, other people might think X, Y, and Z about the drugs, and what he's really saying that he thought X, Y, and Z. He thought those things about them.
Right.
And secondly, I also agree with you on the idea that he's leaving behind his career in journalism here. I think he's explicit about that, but that is a really important that gives a really important tone to the entire project of these 10 episodes. He's leaving behind this career, he's saying goodbye to it, and he's a bit I think disappointed in it.
Yes.
There's a great air of disappointment and frustration.
And it was interesting in the note that you made about episode 1, bringing in the kind of capitalist perspective. And I think at the outset of his career, he thought it would make a lot more money than it ended up making. I think maybe that feeds into the disappointment.
Yeah, he talks about his vision that DoseNation would become his website and kind of blogging platform would become a kind of new media platform that we saw, I think in culture, especially I think of in Gawker or Gizmodo. I think he mentioned Gawker as well. I don't know if you're familiar with those websites, but this new media blogging platform that became very popular in the early 2000s, around the same time that Kent was working on DoseNation itself. And he expresses some disappointment in that it wasn't picked up by didn't scale, using some of the terms of online branding here. His brand didn't scale upwards to the degree that he thought it would, and he has complaints about Google ad traffic and being used against him and things like that. So there is a career, that's an important context here, is that Kent was envisioning a career in journalism. In fact, that was his career here. He was working in the 90s, as far as I know, on this several magazines, or maybe one in particular, TRP, I think it was called, and then this DoseNation website to run our news articles, and that in fact is one of his kind of initial complaints, is that he in fact views the so-called community as actually being quite small. It couldn't, in his mind, sustain his sort of endeavor. And I think that's another contextual point here, is that he views the psychedelics community as very small and perhaps too insular, too kind of isolated and involving a lot of groupthink.
So there's a lot of kind of frustration and negative feelings towards this community, and I think especially there's a competitive element to it. And I think a lot of his targets of his criticisms are basically people who tried to do similar to what he did but were more successful at it. So people like Terence McKenna, and he even talks about Albert Hoffman. And I sometimes feel like it's almost like a smear job, and he's trying to smear those people. And I'm going to come back to that idea when I talk about his critique of Albert Hoffman. It seems quite unfair and quite attacking towards these people who expressed these ideas that and they were very successful in their publishing careers. So he's kind of channeled that whole negative frustration and turned it into this project of recording these 10 episodes where he attacks all of the main ideas, especially the idea that psychedelia ought to be connected with religion. But one thing I wanted to say as well was that I detected that, like, my overall broadest possible summary of the whole project is to say I think it's based on a blunt self-contradiction. Because on the one hand, Kent is very explicit and open and honest about the shape of his career trajectory and his life trajectory, that it started because of a psychotic bad trip that he had, that he then desperately wanted an explanation for. So in other words, he got into psychedelic drugs and then he stumbled across the kind of ego death, panic attack, psychotic bad trip experience, and it transformed his whole life and set him on a completely new path. So that's one side of the story. But then on the other side of the story, he's now recording these 10 episodes saying that this is not a legitimate religious experience. And that strikes me as an inherent contradiction that thoroughly permeates this whole project.
A contradiction in that his own life, the course of his life itself refutes the idea that they're not significant, that they don't have a significant import. Yeah, it's like an expression of regret. I think that's something that you touched on earlier. There's a regretfulness to this. He regrets that he took them seriously, and leading to a very scorched earth attitude. That's the term I keep coming back to, and I think that chimes with your idea of it being a lot of smear jobs. That the implication here is that when we using these terms like scorched earth or smear job in the approach to dealing with someone's viewpoints, that means that there's we're not really trying to take, or we're not being generous. If we're doing a smear job or if we're doing a scorched earth tactic with somebody's ideas, we're not being generous in what that author is trying to say or trying to enunciate. We are kind of tendentiously presenting their viewpoints in the most negative light possible in order to dismiss them. And you mentioned the Albert Hoffman episode 3. I really reacted to that one in the same way. That's not then to defend every single word that Albert Hoffman wrote, but it left a bad taste in my mouth of the kind of scorched earth smear job thing. So, but returning to your point about an inherent contradiction, should we just I'm just going to rephrase that here to get us back on track, that he is upfront and honest that he experienced a significant bad trip. I mean, something we would put in the ego death experience area, and that then inspired him on his career in psychedelic publishing. And then now he is claiming that, in fact, they have no actual import upon life.
Except that the fact that he's saying that now doesn't change the fact that this was the shape of his life. That's what I see as a contradiction. Mm-hmm. That he might disagree with it now, but the fact was he took drugs and it put his whole life in a different perspective. Which even now in his older, wiser years, he's still going to the effort to record podcast episodes to talk about this thing. So it just strikes me that there's a level of denial. It seems that the mystical potential of psychedelics is the potential to transform the way that a person thinks. And he's had that. He's a perfect exemplar of a typical psychedelic initiate. He's an ego death initiate. Right. So I just don't see how he can kind of accommodate those two points of view comfortably into his head at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think. Well, if we want to keep going on that point for a moment before getting into some of the details, I think that some of that can be attributed to James Kent's particular understandings of what counts as religious or spiritual or mystical. Over the course of the episodes, he has a very constrained idea of what counts as those things, and so he can say that, it's being used for some spiritual purpose that's not true. Whereas I think armed with the ego death theory, we have a different configuration of what we understand religious to mean than James Kent does.
Right, and I don't think at any point in the whole 30 hours of podcasting he ever mentions the crucial subject area of religious mythology. Because, I mean, he seems to employ a kind of unpleasant equals unmystical fallacy right throughout his thinking. And, what I would love to be able to explain to him is that if you look at religious mythology, you can see that you can see many, many depictions of people undergoing mystical experiences that are also very, very unpleasant and psychotic and crazy. And all of these terms that he uses to imply non-mystical. So I wanted to read out a comment. This is a direct quote from James Kent in episode 1, 3 minutes and 45 seconds. He says this, and I think this really summarizes this point of view. So he says, "I do not particularly see psychedelics, the use of psychedelics, as a lofty pursuit or something that needs to be taken very seriously because of spiritual overtones or sacred nature or all of these various other archetypes that get thrown into the psychedelic experience. To me, it seems that's all people want to talk about. That's all people want to hear. nobody wants to get down to the crazier side of psychedelics, the more drastic side of psychedelics. So it seems to me there that there's a direct implication that what he calls the crazier side and the more drastic side is not has no spiritual overtones, no sacred nature, and no relevance to these various other archetypes, relating to religion, spirituality, mysticism, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That again adds into the self-contradiction, because he talks about how transformative the psychotic bad trip in his own life was.
Right, which he clearly doesn't view as spiritual or religious.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. He doesn't. He doesn't make that key connection.
Right. And I think that there is a, he's got a certain sort of point there that the community, perhaps, or perhaps you might more broadly say New Age movements that, I'm thinking in episode 4 that I just listened to recently, he talks about New Age ideas in the American West Coast, that they are often overly focused on the peace and light aspects of spirituality. And so I think he has a certain point that the community can be overly focused on saying, oh, the entheogens provide, great spiritual awakening and enlightenment, etc. And that oftentimes I find the connection between spirituality and the really terrifying ego death experience, that threat to self-control, the deep problematization of self-control, and the way that deeply affects our sense of self and world, is often, I think there's some truth there that the community itself doesn't talk about, doesn't allow for that not darker side. I don't want to fall too much into his framing, the darker side of psychedelics, but it's perhaps over-eager to emphasize the peace and light aspects. I think that this came up in some of our chats about Martin Ball, for example, that Martin Ball has the shadow side, the shadow, something like that, this term, the shadow, and that's something to be avoided. And that, in fact, when we take psychedelics, we want to get into the non-dual experiencing and avoid the shadow. So it's for example, Martin Ball, that's there, but it's something to be avoided.
Right. I think what you're touching on now is precisely the place where the ego death theory provides a third perspective. So you've got the pop psych perspective on the subject of terrifying bad trips, and then you've got James Kent's perspective on the subject of terrifying bad trips, and neither of them come close to really what the account that the ego death theory offers about the significance of the terrifying bad trip experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that dovetails with what we were trying to say earlier, that we have a broader understanding of what counts as religion, right, than either of these two camps. That actually, I was glad to hear you say that third option. That was a term that came back to me rather strongly listening to some of these episodes, that the ego death theory, this model that we're working in, is really distinctly different from those two camps.
Right. So you've got the pop psych narrative, and then you've got the anti-pop psych counter narrative, and the ego death theory is completely separate from both of those two narratives, and it shines perspective onto both of them and casts them in a new light.
It does, yeah. It encourages me that it is the path forward, whether it's. But I think that I just want to touch on too. I think this is some of the relevant to the details of episode 1 as well. And the quote you just read out is, Kent's focused on this darker side of psychedelics, the crazier side of psychedelics, and he deploys continuously a notion of psychosis throughout these podcasts. Do you think that's something worth touching on now?
I can't remember the extent to which he goes through that, talks about psychosis in the first episode in particular, but it's clearly a recurrent theme throughout the whole thing. Like, he has a very mixed up interpretation of what psychosis means. Like, there's one episode where he says, even if you have a song stuck in your head, that could be interpreted as a form of psychosis because it's an uncontrollable thought. And I think he's got a point there in terms of defining psychosis as uncontrollable mental content, uncontrollable thinking. But at the same time, that's incorrect to say that even something as trivial as having a repetitive song stuck in your head would be an example of psychosis. But was there anything you in particular wanted to say about his characterization of psychosis?
Well, I think what I was hitting on here and why it seemed relevant to the very beginning is this almost obsession he has with the darker side, or at least the framing that he is pointing out the darker side. Everyone else is so focused on the peace and light side, but I, James Kent, am here to remind everyone that there's a darker side to psychedelics and that that's why they were prohibited.
Right.
And that psychosis is very real. There are very real dangers. People have had their lives destroyed by taking a psychedelic. And that's why they were illegalized in the late 60s, or LSD. And that is all legitimate because psychosis is real. And psychedelics are the cause or a cause of psychosis.
I think it's a shame that the expression divine psychosis or mystical psychosis is not present in his thinking. He wouldn't think to combine those two terms.
No, I don't think so. No.
He would think that a genuine mystical or religious experience would have to be positive and blissful, peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's one principle which he repeats several times, which I think neatly summarizes his view, which he says that tripping, psychedelia, is incompatible with modern Western values on a fundamental level. So it's illegitimate. It's not valid.
Right.
And so I think in that sense, you could actually characterize Kent as a prohibitionist, even though he claims not to be. He claims to, in a very tepid way, he claims to support the decriminalization of psychedelic drugs. But when he says something like that, he says tripping is incompatible with modern Western values, he's really echoing the very kind of thinking that leads to prohibition. And
yes.
I think in a way he's almost trying to add to it, trying to support it by saying, okay, so psychedelic drugs were made illegal in the 60s, and that didn't actually achieve the goal of wiping them out and stopping people from using them. So now here's me, and I'm gonna give my input to that effort by explaining how illegitimate they are and how they are not connected with religion, and really they're just a bit of fun. So it really does strike me that he's either pro-prohibitionism or directly prohibitionist. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I sense that as well. There's I have a note here that in the first episode, I have a time mark here, 1 hour and 28 minutes, claims that psychedelics are incompatible with modern Western culture, and that's why they were made illegal. I believe that he states it as a direct cause of their being made illegal, as really the only cause that he mentions is because they are somehow incompatible with modern Western culture.
So he's really saying two things. He's saying they're incompatible with, he's saying the reason they were made illegal is because they were thought to be incompatible with modern Western values. And he's also saying that he agrees with that assessment, that they are incompatible with modern Western values. So really, logically, it does imply that he's a prohibitionist.
That he views prohibition as a natural response to the proliferation of psychedelics in the 1960s.
Right. And he goes into that in quite some detail in a subsequent episode about his anthropological style theory about how cultures inevitably grow out of what he calls visionary ritual, which is clearly just a euphemism for psychedelic tripping and psychedelic religious ceremonial style events. He says that that's a sign of a primitive culture, but then as cultures develop and evolve, they discover science and scientific materialism, and then at that point, psychedelia falls into incompatibility, and thus is grown out of. So in that sense, prohibition is, yes, a natural anthropological response to merely the evolution of Western culture. So he has quite an anthropocentric idea of Western culture as being at the the most evolved form of culture, ahead of the kind of cultures where drug use might be accepted, like a shamanic culture, or maybe like some places in India or Thailand or some places like that.
Yes, it's rather striking to see that such a framing, the primitive versus modern framing. I mean, if you're familiar, if you recall, one of my postings that I turned into a whole page was on competing theories of mythology, that almost a vast majority of them, theories of mythology, are based around anthropological theorizing. And so that notion that Ken is deploying is, as far as I can tell, I'm not a modern anthropologist, or I'm not familiar, but as far as I can tell, that's this notion of cultural development like that is very outdated within the field of anthropology. Not something that it's certainly not something that we can present as a truism, that cultures move naturally from a visionary state to a more modern state of development. That's something that would have been popular in the late 19th century.
Right.
And so it was striking to me to see your notes on that. I haven't listened to that episode yet, but I was like, wow, I didn't think to see somebody in the 21st century deploying this. I'm not simply saying that. I don't mean to imply that all older ideas are outdated, but it was quite striking to see, especially deployed as if that is the only option or the truth of human cultural development. This kind of primitive talk of primitives in that way. I think it'd be worth trying to unpack some of what do we think James Kent means by modern Western culture.
Mm-hmm.
What does that? What do you think that means to James Kent? What is modern Western culture? And in that first episode, he has a section talking about how psychedelics cause people to dislike modern culture, modern Western culture, and turn to shamanic cultures. They cause people to laugh at cultural tradition, I believe he says at one point.
To laugh at cultural tradition, right? I think when he talks about modern Western culture, he's referring to principles like scientific materialism and high technology. That seems to be the main focus of what he thinks about by modernity,
mm-hmm.
Western modernity.
Mm-hmm. It seems to be a definition of Western culture that is set up in opposition to his target. His target here are people like modern Americans primarily, in his experience, who turn towards shamanic cultures from South America, for example, or to Buddhism perhaps, and embrace a more kind of spirit or religious model in his narrow definition of what counts as spirituality and religion, away from the context that they were raised in. So it's it's a definition of modern Western culture that is just there. It's like defined from the outset in opposition to his real target. Like, he wants to argue against people who are turning to spirit traditions, and then he says that they do so because they're turning away from this other thing. Well, the other thing is really just a placeholder. I mean, to me, it seems odd because it treats Western culture as if it doesn't have its own. Western culture is somehow without its own traditions of the occult or esotericism or spirituality, even in the kind of reduced narrow form that he uses them in.
I see what you mean. I think part of that project as well, which we'll talk about with reference to later episodes, is he's denying that there is any history or tradition of psychedelic use within Western culture. He sees that as something that is just exclusively new since the 1960s.
Yes. Yeah, you can feel that in this first episode. It's a whole discussion of prohibition and psychedelia in the West seems to assume that it just started in more or less in the 60s, maybe earlier in the 20th century with mescaline and Huxley and people like that. But that before that, it didn't exist in the West.
And that really comes very clearly in later episodes when he talks about Christianity and about the various writers that connect psychedelic drugs to Christianity. But we'll get to that in good time. There was one other thing, one other kind of rhetorical strategy that I became aware of starting from the first episode, which he carries on right throughout the 10 episodes, which is based around the word hallucination and to hallucinate. And sometimes he uses the word illusion, but he's fond of using the word hallucination and hallucinogen as a name for psychedelic drugs, without any real awareness of the kind of outdated nature of that name. And I think there's some uncertainty about what exactly the word hallucination means with reference to psychedelic phenomenology. But what James Kent does, he uses the word hallucination specifically to delegitimize and diminish psychedelic phenomenology. So he'll say something like, you might feel that you've transcended the world and become one with God when you're tripping, but that's just because you're under the influence of a hallucinogen. So hallucination means not real. And that's his delegitimization strategy. Did you notice that from the first episode?
I don't think I didn't notice that from the first episode, but that becomes clearer, I think, especially by the third episode, that everything that one experiences is a hallucination while on drugs. They are hallucinogens, and that also, I think that fits in very much with what we're saying. It's at least compliant with prohibition, if not actively pro-prohibition or justifying prohibition. I was amazed to see him continuing to use that term of hallucination, because it seemed in my own experience studying psychedelics that was a almost a very early idea to explore and discard, to understand that the use of the term hallucination is a very loaded term that presupposes the presupposes that I guess we could say the normal state of consciousness or the tight cognition state of consciousness as the baseline norm with which to evaluate experiences within the mind and within consciousness. I'm thinking of it's been a while since I've read him, but the author Charles Tart, I believe, addresses this and calls for a multi-state cognitive science. Hell, even William James, for example, the American psychologist, saying that there's, my impression from all those studies those authors is that psychology, there's a critique there of basing our psychology purely on or taking the normal waking state of consciousness as the baseline with which to evaluate other states of consciousness leads to a distorted model of the mind and of psychology. That seems to be the point, and that has often been the point where I've encountered critiques of the term hallucination. And so to see James Kent just deploy it again seemed like it was strange to see it deployed without any discussion of all of that writing that has gone on, all that arguing that has gone on about the term hallucination and hallucinogen. James Kent just doesn't even acknowledge that debate even exists.
Because it doesn't suit his project of delegitimization.
Exactly. This is another point we're trying to support here, this very smear job or scorched-earth strategy or tendentious strategy of arguing. It's kind of a cherry-picking sort of endeavor.
Yeah, I wrote this paper, Cognitive Phenomenology of Mind Manifestation, used a couple of authors like Alan Watts and also Benny Shannon to make the point that it's the inverse of hallucinogen is more like the truth, in the sense that certain things seem to be true during the ordinary state of consciousness, but then from the perspective of the intense psychedelic trip, looking back at the ordinary state of consciousness, it looks like you're hallucinating. So, for example, self-control, from the point of the intense ego death experience, it looks like self-control had been a hallucination. So it's the inverse. It's correcting a hallucination rather than causing a hallucination is a more accurate characterization of psychedelic phenomenology.
Right. It's like the question of where do we base? What's our starting point? And it seems to me that psychedelics make us question where our starting point is in the first place. So that's part of the growth into a different mental world model that doesn't start from and only assume that the normal state of consciousness is the world model. James Kent is starting from there and saying that is the only world model, is the normal state of consciousness. And the psychedelic experience is just this weird, as you said, as he said, paraphrasing him, it's just something that you do for fun and to have maybe a weird experience. He pays some lip service and says one might get some vague psychological insight, but that's all.
Yes, and he tepidly supports psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. He says you might get some kind of psychotherapeutic benefits from taking psychedelics with a licensed psychotherapist, something like that. But any support that he does give for any kind of positive assertion towards psychedelic drugs, it's always very limited and restricted and full of caveats. Like, he's much more intent on being negative towards psychedelic drugs than positive.
Yes, which he frames in a kind of like pro-safety framing that other ideas could potentially cause people to take big doses, which could potentially cause permanent psychotic damage. And so anyone who advocates a real medicinal aspect or a religious aspect, a spiritual aspect, is potentially causing damage and is being irresponsible.
Right.
And that starts to... Well, I think that really starts to come out in episode 2.
I mean, I was going to say, unless you've got anything specifically more to say about episode 1, I was going to say let's properly move on to episode 2.
If you don't mind, I do have a few just notes I'd like to riff on for a second. On the modern... Picking up the thread on what he thinks modern Western culture is, I thought it bizarre. So he seems to interpret it as primarily about consumerism. This seems to be incredibly American. That Western culture is about consuming products and gadgets, and that psychedelics cause people to turn away from Western culture, which he narrowly means consumerism, and to embracing some other tradition. But so I think that it's a kind of loaded set of statements that are all open to questioning. I've already hinted at the idea that Western culture equals consumerism is a bizarre option. There's certainly a lot of consumerism in modern American culture, of course, but to make that the only option is a little disheartening, I think, on one level. Right. It's also not true. And then there's a larger causal problem. He wants to say psychedelics cause a lot of things, so that someone would. You alluded to this at the beginning, where someone changed his life. Someone changes their life after a big trip. Well, he says that the psychedelics cause that change of life, implying that it would never have happened. People would never have made the choices they had made unless they had taken the psychedelic. The same thing here with this idea of turning away from and embracing another culture's tradition. He says that's an inevitable outcome of people taking psychedelics. I believe he even says that it leads people, or it inevitably leads people to do that. So again, there's this kind of very constrained framing of ideas, as if that were the only thing that would cause somebody to take an interest in a non-modern American culture, is that they took a psychedelic and became disillusioned with American culture. It also can't account, this framing that taking a psychedelic causes one to become disillusioned with one's culture. It can't account for a community that would use psychedelics to, in fact, reinforce the culture or the tradition, which is certainly our model with places like the for example, our model of saying that the mystery cults of antiquity, for example, like Eleusis or other mystery cults of antiquity, there is a way of teaching the cultural tradition that psychedelics are wrapped up in at a place like Eleusis or in other contexts in antiquity that I always love to talk about. You could imagine modern contexts as well in which that is the case. That they are not being, there's this very 1960s, American 1960s counterculture idea that psychedelics inherently cause people to drop out or question their received culture that Kent just assumes is true. He takes as true. And I don't, that's an overly narrow framing. Psychedelics can just as well be used to reinforce a cultural tradition.
Right. Except that in that case, he would probably say that the culture would have to be at a more primitive level in order for that to be the case.
Ah, great point. Okay, great point. We've evolved past that now. We are such an evolved state and a developed state that there's no other option. You either like regress back to a primitive state, or you stay modern consumer culture.
Right, so where an individual person had taken psychedelics and then gone off to India to embrace Buddhism or gone to the rainforest or something, that would be, for Kent, a regressive move, like a backwards evolutionary move for them to have done that, which would be a bad thing.
There's a certain scorched earth, a certain style that I associate with hardline scorched earth atheists, that any, for example, going to the rainforest or going to, turning to doing anything except embracing modern culture is a kind of incoherent, regressive move that only people who do the awful thing of believing in religion, and we can get into talking about James Kent's problems with belief at a later stage, but I think that comes out in some of episode 1 towards the end. There is at the same time as I'm critiquing him, I do also just want to bring up that I think there's some validity in criticizing the just turning towards another culture as if it were the answer to the problems. That's answer to a problem in one's life or in society. That's something that Kent critiques, that just choosing another culture and then adopting its practices is, I think he would probably say it's inauthentic. And I think that that's a fair critique, that you're not going to just find an answer for a problem in another culture. So there's a larger impression I have of Ken is that there's some validity amongst these critiques. I disagree with a lot of the framing and a lot of the assumptions. Same thing, he talks about like self-improvement via psychedelics towards the end of the first episode. And I've written down that it's a fair critique. At an hour and 40 minutes, I have a note here that he is speaking against the concept of self-improvement via psychedelics, that they're somehow going to make you a better person or a more enlightened person or a better functioning person or something like that. And he says, no, they don't do that at all. They're just for fun, etc. And maybe you get some insights, that sort of thing. And I think that there's a fair critique that if we're presenting psychedelics as bringing us some benefit, that's kind of missing a lot of the, we have to be careful about how we define that. We don't want to, that's something that could easily fall into egoic, a reification or a reinforcing of possibilism and egoic thought. So there's a fair critique there. I wouldn't frame it in the terms that he does at all. He's very scorched earth, cynical, nihilistic almost. There's only life and behaviors. There's only like all people care about is money and profit. There's nothing else in the world except for life and behaviors and party culture and stuff like that. So it's in a certain sense, I support some of what he's saying, but not his whole framing of it at all. So I think that's some of my interest in this project there. Yeah, thanks. That's what I had to add about episode 1 there towards the end.
Sure, right, okay, yeah. I mean, I think to answer Kent from the perspective of ego death theory, you'd have to specify that the kind of self-improvement that you get is not ego level self-improvement, but rather gaining an awareness of the mystic altered state.
Great, yes. And we can frame that as a improvement from not having awareness of it. But it's certainly not as kind of like personal, career advancement, or like now I'm an ethically better person. And in fact, has a lot to say about ethics and morals, a complete reframing of them.
Okay, so then moving on to episode 2, it struck me that, the strength with which he reveals in this episode that from his own personal experience, he is a full-blown insider psychedelic initiate. He's had a very, very bad trip of psychotic panic attack, and he's kind of been through that and then integrated it and then lived the rest of his life in light of that experience. But then after all of that, at the culmination of all these years of thinking about it and doing interviews and journalism, what he has concluded is that the purest and most legitimate form of psychedelic culture, as attested by him, as granted legitimacy by him, is the party culture, where people get together at festivals and nightclubs and listen to music under the influence of drugs and have a really good time. And I did actually quite like that that suggestion. I think he makes an important point in that the party culture is lacking any kind of additional attempt at interpretation. It's pure from interpretation, whereas anything else, whether it's the kind of going to the rainforest to drink ayahuasca or the various other ways that psychedelic drugs are used, includes an inbuilt interpretation. Whereas when you're just having fun, you don't need to worry about what the meaning or the significance of the experience is. You're just dancing and partying. And then he kind of uses that idea to mount a critique of religious and shamanic interpretations of psychedelia. So, for example, he talks about how shamanism gives a kind of medical type of treatment of psychedelia. They use psychedelic drugs to heal people with this whole cultural baggage of shamanic mythology, but that is unofficial and unaccountable. It doesn't have a governing body like medical doctors have to be a part of. So it's just every shaman has their own individual standard and their own individual way of doing it. They're not held accountable by any higher organization. So that's his kind of critique of shamanic healing interpretation of psychedelic drugs. And then he comes on to the topic of psychedelic drugs being rebranded as entheogens. He uses the term rebranding, but I think a more neutral term would simply be renaming. So they went through various stages of names throughout the history. So they went from being hallucinogens to psychedelic drugs, and then post 1960s they were called entheogens. And again, James Kent just sees that renaming as being part of the legitimization strategy, as if a connection between psychedelic drugs and religion was invented out of thin air just in order to create this legitimization to counter prohibition, because he sets this historically in the 1970s after prohibition had kicked in, when psychedelic drugs were illegal. He's saying that renaming them entheogens was a response to that, to try to inject some legitimization, which is fascinating. And that's where the unpleasant equals unmystical fallacy really starts to become very apparent, that he thinks that they can't possibly be true entheogens or cause true religious experience because of the fact that they cause these bad experiences. So he says that the word entheogen, or even calling it a sacrament, is a bad thing. It's an illegitimate move because there's no implicit warning in the word entheogen that if you take too much drugs, you can have a bad trip. So he's very against this kind of branding movement around psychedelic drugs to try to increase their legitimacy, and he thinks that's the only reason that psychedelic drugs would be connected with religion. And that, to me, strikes me as amazing that he could be that blind to the simple fact of psychedelic phenomenology, that even in his own case, psychedelic drugs cause life-changing, mind-transforming experiences. So I don't think he ever mentions the research from Roland Griffiths following up the 1960s Good Friday study, which establishes by means of a kind of academically defined meaning of what a mystical experience is, that when you give volunteer subjects psychedelic drugs, they have genuine mystical experience. He doesn't seem to incorporate that point of view, that the simple fact that when you take drugs, you have these kind of experiences that can be interpreted in that kind of way. And then he comes to the subject of the historical use of entheogenic plants. And now there seems to be another quite major contradiction in Kent's thinking, because he does explicitly acknowledge that there is multiple instances that are undeniable of cases around the world where primitive cultures use psychedelic plants as part of religious ceremonies. So he admits that. And then he comes to the point of Christianity, where he also seems to admit that there would have been some connection between ancient Christianity and psychedelic drugs, like eating mushrooms. But at the same time, he says that it has been overextended, and that people see, for example, Amanita mushrooms in Christian art, where actually they're just committing a kind of confirmation bias, where they're seeing mushrooms where actually the artist was not intending to depict mushrooms. So he seems to be admitting a connection between religion and psychedelic drugs and denying it in the same part of his talking, and at that in that moment in episode 2, which I thought was very surprising, and he continues to do that in subsequent episodes.
Yeah, so if he has that whole episode, I believe it's 8 later on, dedicated to the Christianity and Amanita question.
So he doesn't. I'm not sure that he's admitting any kind of connection between Amanita and Christianity, or if he's saying that it's been 100% fabricated, or if he's just saying that it has been exaggerated. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there does seem to be a contradiction there between any connection whatsoever between psychedelics and religion versus no connection whatsoever. He doesn't seem to be quite sure which side he's coming down on that debate. And then he brings Terence McKenna into the discussion, and mentions how what Terence's strategy was to put psychedelic drugs right back to the beginning of the dawn of man in his book Food of the Gods, like, so that to counter the narrative that psychedelics were only really discovered in the 1960s. There might have been some very limited use of psychedelic drugs before then. What Terence is doing in Food of the Gods is he's putting psychedelic drug use right back to the beginning of time, to the beginning of human evolution. So the point of view that Kent seems to be expressing here is that the history of psychedelic use has been overstated as part of the legitimization strategy. And at the same time as overstating use of psychedelics in history, the potential danger of bad trips is understated. So this is a pretty crucial central critique that he's leveling at the pop psychedelia narrative. At the same time, they overstate history of psychedelic use, and they understate this terrible danger of going crazy. So he's kind of saying psychedelic drugs might be the origin and essence of religion, but they are also very dangerous because they cause bad trips and they might make you go crazy. So Kent is emphasizing here that the pop psychedelia legitimization project is too keen to inflate the benefits and the historical significance of psychedelics, whilst at the same time ignoring the bad trips, craziness, danger aspect of psychedelic use. And it's like you said earlier, I do think that he's making a very important point here insofar as this is a critique of pop psychedelia, because it's certainly true that, as you mentioned with the example of Martin Ball, the way he addresses the shadow as this kind of dangerous area to be mostly ignored, but just vaguely mentioned, but never really tackled head on. Pop psychedelia certainly does have a tendency to do that. I don't think it's fair to make that accusation towards Terence McKenna, but it's certainly it permeates quite a lot of pop psychedelia. They don't really know what to do with the topic of bad trips because they feel that bad trips are inherently de-legitimizing, and they are so overzealous about wanting to legitimize the drugs that they kind of treat bad trips as if they're some kind of toxic waste or like a hot potato. They don't really want to touch it. They don't really know what to do with it, how to deal with it. And then what Kent is coming out in response to that and saying, here, I'm actually being honest and addressing the bad trip issue, the fact that psychedelic drugs can cause mental health problems. So he sees himself as being more honest than pop psychedelia in this regard. But I think that he goes too far in saying that because psychedelic drugs give you bad trips, that means that they are not valid, that they cannot be legitimately connected to religion.
Great. I've been nodding along through this whole time. Particularly at the end, I think that what I think that's really great an insight that in a way, the community, so to speak, I don't even like using that term, popular pop psych discourse, because of not having a way of acknowledging and incorporating the so-called bad trip, by not focusing on it and not following through the implications of it, I think, which is what, one way I think of talking about something the ego death theory does, is focus on that aspect as the real point and gateway. But by not doing that, the pop psych discourse has left itself open to the sort of, it's vulnerable in the way to the sort of critique that Kent has, that, hey, you're not talking about, people who have really awful experiences and have, lasting damage. Again, I think that the framing is Kent's framing there is very like sensationalistic and very focused on, some concepts of mental health and therapy that we can talk about in more detail that I think are questionable. But there is, I do find myself in agreement with that part of that aspect of Kent's project, that there's, the pop psych discourse doesn't know what to do. It's just trying to avoid the, what they, popularly we call the bad trip, so to speak, but, speaking more precisely, we mean that like intense problematizing of self-control and the panic and that comes along with that for the individual. I think that, you touched on a lot there. I think that's a great summary of the episode. There's three parts, I think, to this episode. There's his defining of these legitimization strategies. There's his praise of party culture. And there's his discussion about bad trips and his own experience with that and the effect it had on his life. And to add my thoughts to what you said, I think that maybe we can start with the party culture. That's another thing I support. I think that, party culture is great. I've experience with that. I think that I always bristle when I see voices in the psychedelic community like put down things like rock concerts as a venue for taking psychedelics and things like that. I think that is rankles me. I mean, I came up through rock concerts. You know, that's my own cultural background in a lot of ways, and you know, I don't know if I quite agree with Kent's framing that there is no purpose. I mean, just thinking of the rock concert kind of environment, if we think of the lyrical content of some of the artists, they certainly have points to them. You know, the way Michael Hoffman, for example, is identified in, you know, lyrics to various groups, Metallica, Rush, etc., that they are, you know, they're very close to their poetic expression of themes of ego death themes that he systematized. You know, there's a point there in that sense, but it's not tied to these kind of cultural. It's certainly not tied to the other legitimization strategies that can identify. So I take the point there. I don't think it's totally without. I don't think party culture is totally without its own things that we may call spiritual, I suppose.
What you are saying that party culture has this spiritual element to it?
I think it can, certainly. But it's not this kind of top down. Maybe that's more of the point. It's not top down. There's no organization. There's no giant charities that are, you know, potentially who have a message to put out. You know, I'm thinking of someone like Maps, who is very interested in a certain sort of project of legitimizing, I mean, very much so, legitimizing scientific research in that normal mode that we do scientific research. Maps is very concerned with legitimizing that, and, for example, so they have a message that they're trying to put out. It's whereas party culture, it's hard to identify. I mean, party culture is a big amorphous thing. You know, it might even, how do we even define that? It's just people taking psychedelics, perhaps, and having, you know, doing it at a party. That's all. That could be a huge different venues with different purposes. You know, I think that there's also, to pull up the ancient context that I always love to, we have the symposium drinking parties in ancient Greece, especially in Athens. That could be said to be a party culture, but it's a culture that, I mean, it's tied to a lot of other things. There would be elements that Kent would probably disapprove of, religious elements to that, because of the presence of the Greek gods, for example. So I think that what I'm trying to express, I think that what I'm trying to express is that there's, I don't quite understand the idea of a pure party culture. I can definitely agree that there's like party culture is something that is definitely left out of, unfairly left out of pop psych discourse. But do you see what I'm trying to get at? That there's party culture itself, to say that it's just its own thing without any other, that it's somehow pure. I don't quite understand that. Maybe do you have a different take on that?
I can see what he means by the purity, in the sense of it doesn't have, it's not trying to commoditize psychedelic drugs for some kind of benefits. Well, I suppose
Gotcha.
They are in a way, because they say that because you take drugs to have a good time when you're listening to music at a music event. But I don't know really about that. Like, I kind of see his point that there's something that seems to set party culture aside from the rest of pop psych narrative.
Mm-hmm. It's not as concerned with its own legitimization, perhaps. It's not as concerned with saying we're doing something really, really socially important here by, there's no great, news articles saying that we're going to heal everyone by administering psychedelics to them in a controlled setting, something like that. It doesn't have that discourse.
And it doesn't have the attempt to connect psychedelia to religion either. There's no hint of religion in your average music event.
Right. I suppose, yeah, that's the question. I mean, that I think when we say that to me sounds like, again, we have to be careful. What do we mean by religion? I mean, that's what I was trying to point out, that, like, per ego death theory, we would say something like attending a classic rock concert where there are, ego death type lyrics alluding to, mystic state allusions in lyrics. From an ego death perspective, I might say that is a religious context.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Do you see what I mean? Whereas, yeah, it's not religious in the sense that the band is not trying to lead people in a certain, in a Buddhist meditation or in a Catholic prayer or something like that.
Right.
Right? So it's not religious in that sense, in our more conventional sense.
Yes, I see. Yeah, it struck me as quite an unfortunate omission that given James Kent's positive feelings towards music and party culture, and also given to the fact that he's clearly so much into that kind of rock music scene, similar to Michael Hoffman's musical scene, because the whole podcast is interspersed with clips from rock songs, that he completely lacks an understanding of lyrics as allusions to mystic state phenomena. And I'm sure even in the songs that he plays during the podcast, there are probably mystic state references. And he seems completely blind to that whole dimension of lyrical music.
No, I agree. I didn't detect any deep recognition of that. In episode 3 has Tomorrow Never Knows, a Beatles song in it. Episode 4 has a Blue Oyster Cult song. I mean, these are key lyrical examples that he seems to interpret literally. I mean, I'm a veteran of the psychic war. Interpreted in terms of his life, his like mundane daily life itself. That he's a veteran of the psychic war, not a understanding in altered state, 4D, etc. But that's perhaps moving slightly away from the party culture. I mean, I do just want to say, like, yes, pro-party culture is...
Yeah.
I'm fully on board with that.
So this is a point where, you and I both agree with Kent on this point, that party culture is not a bad thing, even though the pop psych narrative has quite it kind of looks down its nose at party culture and has quite a disparaging view of it.
Often blaming it for prohibition. That's a whole other topic, but often prohibition happened because people went too far. A lot of them
in the 60s, yeah.
Yes, people went too far, and that's why I often associate that with the scientists, the scientific researchers who are bemoan the fact that drugs became illegal for they're unable to do research with them. You often see in publications from them and their organizations that it's it's all too bad that they were made illegal because people went too far in essentially blaming party culture and blaming users for prohibition.
Right, instead of blaming the establishment, they blame the users. That seems quite unfair.
Yes. So speaking of prohibition, then Kent has the 3, as you laid out, the 3 what he calls legitimization strategies, and you touched on this, and that was my main takeaway as well, that I found it very odd that he treats these interests in a medical usage and in religious usage and in the historical argument as being something that only happened as a result of prohibition.
Yes.
I mean, he goes very far. He doesn't just say that we could say that, well, prohibition affects the way that people have, publicly talked about these things and has spurred on people to say, oh, well, actually, they should be legal in some cases because they are useful for medical reasons, or they do, there is some church that somewhere that uses a psychedelic, and so we should respect their sacrament, their religious usage. So instead of saying that we end up, pop psych culture has used those narratives, or prohibition has encouraged them or something, he says they are directly caused by. People are only interested in these ideas because of prohibition, which I think it was way too far, and it ends up being, this gets into the smear job territory of like, I can't take, it's hard to take seriously that people's motivations. People would never have been interested in the idea of psychedelics as a sacrament or as a religious experiencing if not for prohibition. That's Kent's position. That's what he says.
Which seems to imply that before prohibition, nobody was ever making the connection between psychedelics and religion, which I think that's demonstrably not true. I'm thinking people like Evans Schultz. The early writers on psychedelic shamanism were doing so completely independently of prohibition, prior to prohibition.
Yep. And in our traces of, we're becoming more aware, Kent is a victim in a way of the success of the way that the 60s movement branded itself as a totally new thing. I associate this with a lot with Leary, that we're bringing, we now have these new technology of psychedelics to bring this. It's totally new, and we're going to be the first people in history to have this great transformation. And that's kind of, that self-promotion, Ken seems to have accepted that as true. And, it's not just him, a lot of people did. And it's taken a lot of time to really bring out the sources, earlier authors. I'm thinking of people like Robert Graves, who talked about psychedelics in the 50s, in the 1950s, as something that people, the ancient Greeks did. And you can see earlier authors who are, and talking about it in a religious context, not just, people were using psychedelics, or we didn't even have the term really, but then you can find earlier authors in the early 20th century and the 19th century talking about them as religious sacraments, maybe not using that term, but in a religious context. So I really want to emphasize that point, that it's not simply something that people started in the late 70s to talk about. But you wouldn't know that from listening to James Kent.
No way. No.
And yet we're supposed to, I'm getting heated here. Yet as James Kent presents himself as a very serious thinker and researcher, and then there's this huge gap. I have
He's not well read in the history of psychedelic writing, I don't think.
But he claims to be. That's my annoyance, I think. Similarly, I was annoyed by the way he brought up the McKenna stoned ape theory as a way to dismiss all of the idea of historical entheogens or historical psychedelics, historical usage.
Right.
He immediately says, well, some people say that it was, that psychedelics were used in society, in Western society beforehand, just like McKenna said that there was a stoned ape, which he clearly means in a dismissive sense. You encounter this with kind of rational or rationality oriented psychedelics people, that they love to harp on the McKenna stoned ape theory as being irrational and as being anti-scientific, and what a loser to make such a silly argument.
Yeah.
And so similarly, Kent deploys it, I think, really quickly to just dismiss out of hand. My analysis of his arguing style there is he chooses what he views as the most damning or wrong-headed argument, regardless of whatever merits the stoned ape argument has. I'm not even talking about that. I'm saying in his mind, he chooses what he views as the most risible, bad argument, and then uses it to dismiss the entire category of the historical scholarship on entheogens, or on psychedelics, or whatever terms we use. I wonder if it's worth mentioning, I think the core of my last idea, what do you think? Should we talk about the bad trips thing? Kent seems to want a trip that doesn't actually affect your life in any way. He wants you to have a trip and just be fun, but it has no effect upon your life.
Yes, because he considers the ongoing effect on life to be fundamentally illegitimate.
Yes, which ties in with one of our initial points about he has some regrets here about his involvement in psychedelics. He acknowledges I have a time note, 1 hour, 16 minutes in episode 2. He acknowledges that bad trips change and alter you, but he doesn't like the idea that bad trips teach you more than other trips and so are more valuable. He's worried about the dangers of saying that. And he wants people to avoid bad trips because they have a lasting impact upon someone's life. And this will be a larger theme moving forward for Kent, that he doesn't want psychedelic trips to actually have any impact upon people's lives. He wants them to be a little bit of fun, but not much more.
Yeah. So it's like during the course of the 10 episodes, it's clear that what he's most interested in is the bad trip experience, but at the same time, he doesn't want anybody to have that. He thinks it's a bad thing, and it's he's kind of warning people in the future generation against it. He even uses the idea of dosage, because whereas Michael Hoffman generally doesn't really emphasize the idea of high dosing to achieve desired ego death effects very much. He's more reserved than that, and Hoffman says more like medium high doses, whereas Kent seems to say, kind of in the same vein as Terence McKenna, that the really interesting effects happen at very, very high doses, and the bad trips happen at very high doses. So he's kind of warning people against taking too high doses of drugs, because those are the ones that have the ongoing effect, and the ones that might make you go crazy and cause the psychotic experience. But I'm not sure. I mean, is Kent saying that nobody should ever have a bad trip? Like, he's equating a bad trip with harm, but he doesn't spell out what the actual harm is. He never says how it harms you, other than, I mean, what does he think, that lots and lots of people go permanently crazy or something like that? I don't know. He doesn't really spell that out. And he says how highly personally significant his own bad trip experience was. Although, like, what I'm now starting to realize, it seems like he regrets that. He had this bad trip experience that changed his life, but he's kind of, he feels bad about the fact that he resents the fact that it changed his life so much, and he's trying to undo the harm of that in saying what he's saying in these 10 episodes.
Yeah, I believe towards the end of episode 2, he says that he didn't know that he had a psychotic episode, though now he knows that for sure, that that's what he had, was a psychotic episode, and that the implication, I think, is that he should have gone to therapy instead of studying psychedelics more. So he's deploying concepts of mental health and psychosis and therapy, again, as if they're the normal baseline thing that everyone, that people should go to therapy all the time in response to a psychedelic trip or a bad trip. And I even have a note here. He says, ends episode 2 by saying that maybe his life would have been different if he had gone to therapy, or if he had understood that he had a psychotic episode.
Right, in a good way.
So it's very right that he says his life would have been different. He wouldn't have waited. I think he views all his psychedelic studying as a waste of time at this stage, which is, I think, a rather sad conclusion. But
it is sad, and especially when you consider that part of the reason for saying that is because he didn't make as much money as he was expecting to. That seems like a shallow reason for just adopting this scorched earth attitude towards psychedelia in general.
Yes. Yep. I think you mentioned in an email to me that it's rather conspicuous that he doesn't mention his book much over the course of these 10 episodes, and I wonder what the reception of that book has been since he published it within the community. Is there an element here that his book hasn't been well received? People haven't been showing the interest he thought it should have? I'm speculating, of course. I have no idea.
Because he doesn't say that, yeah, but that's certainly it's suggested by, it certainly didn't make a huge contribution to pop psychedelia discourse. I think that at your average psychedelic conference nowadays, I don't think most people would have heard of James Kent. He's not one of the really big household names. And also, I want to talk in more depth about his book in a subsequent episode, because I think that deserves some quite focus, some good focus and a bit of time. But it's called Psychedelic Information Theory. And one thing I would say about that is it has been entirely superseded by the work of Robin Carhart Harris. It's almost like an early attempt to do the thing that then Robin Carhart Harris did very successfully and very prominently, very publicly within the pop psych movement, to try to explain psychedelic phenomenology in terms of neurophysical mechanisms. Yes, it didn't go down. It wasn't hugely popular. It hasn't. It's not a very groundbreaking book. Although he probably thinks that it deserved more attention than it actually got within pop psychedelia.